Welcome, listeners. I'm here today with Daniel Pinchbeck. Daniel Pinchbeck is the author of Breaking Open the Head, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, and When Plants Dream, with Sophia Rolkin. In his 2017 book, How Soon Is Now, he explored the systemic changes needed to avert ecological collapse and extinction. His work was featured in the 2010 documentary, 2012, Time for Change, which promoted the value of indigenous knowledge systems. He hosted the talk show Mind Shift for Gaia TV. He speaks at festivals and conferences around the world. He writes a newsletter, danielpinchbeck.substack.com, and runs an online course platform, liminal.news. Daniel Pinchbeck, welcome to our show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure to meet you. So yeah, I've been, as I said off air, I've been following you for a number of years and hoping that we could start with a short backstory about how you got on this particular path.
Sure. I'm in my 50s now. When I was in my 20s, I was working in magazines and editing a literary magazine, and I had a kind of classic existential spiritual crisis, and realized that my friends and I were all basically, sort of nihilist materialists who didn't believe there was any, thing like a soul or a spirit, and life seemed kind of bleak and empty. So, but I remembered psychedelic experiences in college as, suggestive of there being sort of other dimensions of consciousness. So I started exploring them again. I started writing about psychedelics. This was in the late 1990s, when really in New York nobody was talking about them. You'd be laughed at by people for saying you took them seriously. But I ended up going to the Amazon to work with an indigenous community there called the Sequoia. I visited the Bwiti, an indigenous culture in West Africa, in Gabon, to take Iboga. In the Amazon, it was ayahuasca. I visited the indigenous Mazatec in Oaxaca, in the mountains of Huautla de Jimenez, where we discovered the magic mushrooms back in the 50s. I also sort of looked into contemporary shamanism, psychedelics, the Burning Man Festival, this chemist, Shulgin, and I had all these different experiences that ultimately, a lot of them were very psychic or telepathic or mystical in a way, and ultimately, experientially, they shifted my belief system from the reductive materialist paradigm to more of a shamanic, esoteric, Jungian perspective. That led me to write a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, looking at the prophetic knowledge systems of cultures around the planet. Because writing the first book, I realized that there were big gaps in the Western knowledge system, that these indigenous cultures knew a lot that we didn't know. That then led me to start a company called Evolver, and I had a web magazine, Reality Sandwich. We tried to organize local communities for a number of years. Ultimately, I wrote a third book, How Soon Is Now, where I tried to put together an action plan for how we would bring about systemic change. I had Russell Brand and Sting wrote introductions for that book. And so other books, another book about ayahuasca. Now I have some self-published books on Amazon, one about ETs and UFOs, another about the afterlife, kind of ideas around what do we know, what evidence is there for an afterlife, what kind of afterlife is there. So I get to explore all sorts of topics that the mainstream doesn't really let most people explore.
So yeah, I want to just back up a little bit on your bio and pick up a few threads to kind of talk about before we get into the more specific part of what it is that you're doing now. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the psychedelics aspect of this. So you mentioned mushrooms, you mentioned ayahuasca, you mentioned iboga, and to what extent would you say that the actual experiences that you had shaped your understanding of the world and this vision of what is coming in the future?
Yeah, they were very important. And also, I would say that when you go through certain kind of initiatory experiences, you kind of your sort of third eye periscope starts to kind of open up, and therefore things like synchronicities or other types of kind of almost like magical events will become more available even without psychedelics. So they begin to kind of like bleed into your normal life. And actually, where I'm at now, I really haven't done any psychedelics for quite a while, and I still haven't, my worldview has stayed the same. I mean, yeah, so but I think for many people psychedelics are like helpful to actually have these direct experiences, that if you take that seriously, it does change you.
What it of course reminds me of is Carlos Castaneda's series of books, and how in the teachings of Don Juan, the first book, it looks heavily at various different plant substances, and then as he goes along, those fall to the wayside and the work continues. I mean, I don't necessarily believe that it's anything other than fiction. That's a whole different story maybe, but the point is, as metaphor, as a way of describing a path for a lot of people in the modern world, that these psychedelic substances may have a utility at a certain point in a person's personal journey, and then fall away in terms of the necessity to continue down that road.
Yeah, it's very individual. Maybe I'm just, yeah, I mean, I want to get back into them at some point. It's just, I needed to take a little break to sort of separate out what was me without the psychedelics and normal reality. I mean, there's a lot of advantages to psychedelics. I mean, one is they really they can change your perception of time. So in a way, they slow down time because you experience different forms of time. One of the, I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, now it's becoming a multi-billion-dollar industry, and they're studying psilocybin for people with terminal illness, and finding that it helps deal with anxiety around death and dying.
So since the topic of this podcast is healing and spirituality in world cultures, my next question is really a curiosity about, you talked about the 90s of doing things that were certainly fringe at the time. Iboga, psychedelic mushrooms, and ayahuasca at that time, compared to now in 2022, when it seems like ayahuasca is something that people talk about all the time now, including here in New York. And my curiosity is to know what you think about those things used in the context of traditional cultures versus what it seems like, that every weekend of the year there are people ingesting ayahuasca in apartments throughout New York City. So just a word about context, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of complex for me because I kind of see both sides of it. I mean, I don't think that they need to be taken, necessarily in their original context. I mean, I've experimented with friends without ceremony or listening to Western music or whatever. I think as long as you with a good intention and a good heart and support, you can have good experiences. I mean, there's definitely a lot of value also to the traditions, and they bring a lot to it. But I mean, my perspective is that, or has been, psychedelics are, for whatever reason the earth is creating them. They may have grown up in a certain temperate locality that is the right temperature and all that for them, but they're really meant for us, for all of us, for anybody who feels the call and the desire to explore their own consciousness. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ayahuasca analogs also. There's like Syrian rue and Mimosa hostilis or acacia. that create kind of very similar, the same chemical reaction. There's some ideas that these were actually used in the Middle East and may have informed like the origins of like Islam and Judaism and so on. Some possibilities that various mushrooms might have been involved with the early history of Christianity and with ancient Egyptian religion. So yeah, there's a lot that we don't really, people, are researching or speculating, but we don't really know.
I also wanted to talk about time, about our relationship with time, which you picked up on in talking about psychedelics. So time and the natural world, the environment, if you could kind of give us a little bit of an idea of how your work explores those themes.
Well, I explored it a lot in the 2012 book, which I still consider to be my best book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And in particular, in that book, I was looking at Jean Gebser, this Austrian philosopher who wrote a book called The Ever-Present Origin. And in a very kind of Germanic way, he kind of developed this whole thesis around human consciousness evolving into these different structures. So there's like a mutation between them, like a mutational break or something happens. And each of them is, kind of characterized by a different way of relating to time and space. Like Aboriginal means of the origin, and Aboriginal cultures don't really have an idea of like history, for them, like ceremony is designed to maintain the perfect order of creation. They don't really have an idea of progress, they're not really interested in that. Then you have kind of, magical tribal consciousness, which maybe has a dim interest in like past, future, kind of progress in some sense. Then you have mythical civilizations, which have a cyclical model of time, like the Yuga cycle or the Mayans with the long count cycles, or the Egyptians with the precession of the equinoxes. So they're like these giant spirals that turn over thousands of years. According to the Hindus, we're in the Kali Yuga, and eventually there's like the destruction of this age, and it switches back around to the golden age, the Satya Yuga. And then with the modern period, we developed what Gebser calls the mental rational structure of consciousness, and we got obsessed with space and materiality, and we wanted to see everything in material terms. So we kind of tried to spatialize and materialize time. So the way we continually talk about time is like wasting time, spending time, time is money, running out of time. So we're constantly conceiving of time as a material quantity, which we don't have enough of. The Maya, as I wrote about in the 2012 book in great depth, they had a different understanding of time as sort of a loom of synchronicity or synchronization, with the sort of pattern, like a resonant pattern that repeated like recursively on different scales, almost like a symphonic structure or something like that. So yeah, Gebser thought we were on the crux of another mutation into a new form of consciousness, of time-space that would actually give us different capabilities. He called it the integral or the aperspectival, and it would be marked by recognizing that all these different types of time, the ever-present origin, the sort of no time of the eternal now, the cyclical time of the mythical cultures, and the mental rational linear time are all different, lenses or veils. I think called like a diaphanon or something, different ways of relating to time, and we can actually move between them. We don't have to get stuck in them.
So I'm curious about your personal opinion on this, when it comes to the looking at consciousness, looking at it through these various lenses. In your opinion, is there human progress or not?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I argued in my books, like How Soon Is Now, that, to me, it does feel like we're in a process, like an evolutionary birthing process, like kind of like you imagine like an organism that's in the process of fetal development, developing like organs and a nervous system and a brain, and then all the connections in the brain. Humanity over the last hundreds of years developed like the technologies, roads, ships, electricity, satellites. So it's sort of like we've been instinctively guided to, unify the world as sort of this one planetary organism. Although we're still working out of this sort of competitive paradigm, it might be that the crisis we're about to undergo through the geopolitical and ecological emergency is kind of the initiatory shock that forces us to unify as a single planetary organism, overcoming like nation states, political ideologies, economic ideologies, just to deal with the scale of what we've unleashed. Yeah, you could look at all the connections, like the communications network, kind of like the baby when in its brain, all the connections are being formed, or you could look at the multinational corporations as kind of like the nascent organs of humanity, like the energy companies are like the blood in the circulation system, the media companies are like the sensory apparatus, sanitation companies like the liver or the kidney or something. So, but at the moment, there's still, a book that really influenced me was Spontaneous Evolution by Bruce Lipton and Stephen Bear. And they propose that, we're going through this, competition is actually the less evolved way of being. And that when ecosystems become mature, they move more to a cooperation or symbiosis paradigm. So for instance, like a tree is a very cooperative organism, compared to a lion.
So I really appreciate this idea of increasing complexity as this organism that is in the process of developing. So going back to ecological emergency as being a possible catalyst for something better. So in keeping with this notion that I want to look at of progress, do you believe that there is an inevitability of us using it in that way, or do you think that we're on the crux of this fork in the road, one road leading to destruction, one road leading to something better?
Well, it kind of like depends which level you're thinking about. I don't really believe. I'm more of a Vedantist, that I don't really believe in like free will. I think everything is kind of like already happened, like written in like the great book, and we're just kind of living through the scroll in a way, the scroll that's unfolding. So on that level, on some ultimate level, we're just consciousness performing like a spectacle for itself. On the more relative, or experiential level, sure, it feels like there's choices to be made, and there's like the drama of the immediate experience and so on. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, so I mean, I think I get that you're suggesting both at the same time.
Paradoxically, probably yes.
Okay.
In the 2012 book, which, as I said, is kind of like my opus, I kind of ended up at the perspective that a lot of the nature of reality is inherently paradoxical. Mm-hmm. And actually, it's kind of like Zen, like all those koans, like the sound of one hand clapping, where they're trying to sort of break down the mind's desire for kind of a dualistic, rational kind of comprehension, grasping onto something. I think actually the underlying nature of reality is far more paradoxical, and it's when you're able to kind of like rest in both sides of a paradox that you're actually kind of engaging in maybe like an evolutionary progression of consciousness in a way.
So what I get from this and from following your work in general is that there's the theoretical, the philosophical side of this, and at the same time we're living in a tangible reality. So what kind of advice can you have for our listeners in terms of how do we live our life at this time, at this critical juncture where we have all of these incredible possibilities and a real ecological crisis on our hands? What do we do as conscious human beings living at this time?
Sure. It's kind of, I definitely think that the evidence points towards things getting very difficult in the next 10 to 20 years. For instance, like, energy resources, we're seeing, supply chain constrictions and droughts affecting, ordinary products, whether it's like olive oil or Dijon mustard, and This year seemed to be an amplification or acceleration of the climate emergency beyond which wasn't, I've anticipated it for a long time because I gave a lot of thought to how the trajectory works. But it's not like a linear, do. It's more like an exponential, non-linear kind of like process, and so we definitely destabilized the climate, and things like food security is going to become much more difficult, and so on. So as individuals or as families or as communities, we can kind of choose how do we want to situate ourselves within this scenarios where survival becomes more difficult. Do we want to like fight like tooth and claw to survive? Are we willing to try to grow more of our own food and become self-sufficient? Give up various modern things that we've become very dependent on. Personally, of course, this could always change. I mean, also I kind of trust synchronicity or luck or whatever, but I mean, I haven't felt a huge desire to retool my lifestyle. Like like to like grow food on my windowsill, or I mean, I'm living in a tiny apartment in New York. I'm not using a lot of energy. I don't have a car or whatever. But I kind of sort of personally feel at my age, like, all right, if the apocalypse happens, and I'm not one of the ones who survive. I had a good run and it was, fine. I mean, it'd be nice, it'd be interesting to survive. So that's like everybody really should be thinking in those very existential terms. Like, let's say this was the last 10 or 15 years on planet Earth. Like, how would you want to live? What would you want to, how can you fulfill your, deepest quest, your deepest questions,
And in that process, is current Western technology a friend or an enemy?
Well, I mean, it's both. I mean, we have more access to information and knowledge than we ever had before. And like, I can get any book that I want in like a second. Like, that was totally impossible. I could reach out. You reached out to me. I don't even know where you're located. Maybe you're in like Arizona or New Zealand. I don't know, where are you?
Long Island.
Oh, you're not that far, but you could have been farther. But I mean, yeah. So, there's this instant connectivity and accessibility, and if you want to learn how to do chaos magic, or how to do Kabbalah, or how to like bake a potato or whatever, like all the information is available. So that way it's beneficial, but it's having obviously a lot of really horrible effects. Like people in their 20s, particularly, I would say, or in their 30s, but younger people are having their attention spans completely decimated. Like, nobody reads a book, they have no sustained concentration, which makes them prey to kind of fake news, other manipulations, indoctrinations, and so on. So the lack of deep thought and the sort of myopia, cultural myopia, social media is exacerbating like a lot of that. And also it's the surveillance, it's like we've created the most incredible panopticon, beyond what George Orwell probably envisioned in 1984, and people are kind of very willingly giving all of their data and identity up to this sort of monstrosity in a way.
So it's interesting to me that you mention the problems that social media are creating for young people, and I'm just curious if are young people coming to your message?
Are young people coming to my message? Yeah, I mean, some are. I mean, I'm not like I'm not at the stage right now where I feel like, I mean, I have a lot of messages. I feel like I was more influential maybe 7-8 years ago in certain cultures or whatever, and among certain groups of the young. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm doing something different, and my audience seems to be growing. And I haven't done a poll, so I don't know how old they are.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think younger people are in a a pickle. They're in a tough spot. Like, they kind of know that they've been screwed over by the previous generation's inactivity, and there's a lot of kind of resentment, kind of stifled grief. Also, they economically it's very precarious for them. I mean, yeah, this idea that technological civilization was going to make life easier for people. I mean, it does in some ways, but it's also makes it very difficult, in our financial system for many people to figure out how to survive decently. particularly in a country like ours that has really terrible social services and really doesn't, on a systems level, care that much for ordinary people.
I mean, what I'm thinking about right now is your comment about the problems that come as a result of social media, that include falling prey to fake news, but also a more limited attention span when everything comes to you in just sound bites. And you seem to be certainly a proponent of deep philosophical thought. So my question is, I guess, do you have advice for young people today in how to face the world that is emerging?
Well, I mean, I think, you first of all have to be able to make a, coherent assessment of what's happening. And so you can try to figure out what your possibilities are. Whether it makes sense to pursue like corporate, work, or try to get involved in some other type of community-based movement, or learn how to sort of back to the land type thing, and how to take back your time and attention. Kind of like, I mean, I'm always advising people to, I don't even do it. Take a book, go out of their house, leave their phone, sit somewhere, read for a few hours. I mean, these things have really, they've definitely become, all encompassing.
So let's talk a little bit now about what you're involved in today, Daniel. What projects are you doing that our listeners might be interested in tapping into?
Sure. I mean, I have this newsletter that I'm writing all the time, which I'm really enjoying. That's at danielpinchbeck.substack.com. And yes, that's been really, really invigorating and exciting for me. I have a platform of like online courses, like some of them are about, kind of one is called Building Our Regenerative Future. That's like an archived course. Another one is based on my psychedelic book, Breaking Open the Head. I also do ongoing writing workshops. And I'm also working with a team on a Web3 project. We've been fascinated by this sort of NFTs and the DAOs and these different tools that are emerging in this kind of blockchain-based technologies. So we're thinking about how you could make use of those tools for kind of an evolutionary movement around exploration of consciousness, scientific research into consciousness. I mean, some of it will be psychedelic related, but a lot of it won't be. Like, near-death experience, out-of-body experience, communicating with dolphins, stuff like that.
And how do people find out about the courses? I mean, you told me about the newsletter, which is danielpinchbeck.substack.com. What about the courses? How do you access those?
It's a liminal, liminal.news, N-E-W-S.
Great. And the newsletter is free, is that right? Or is there
there is a paid level of subscription, but I make as much content as I can free. Yeah. I just wrote about the double rainbow that appeared the day of Queen Elizabeth's death. This phenomenon, it's actually quite common of these rainbows appearing. Like when David Bowie died, there was also a huge double rainbow in New York, almost at the exact second. And to me, it supports kind of some of the ideas that I wrote about in the 2012 book about the noosphere. This visionary Jose Arguelles talked about the rainbow brain of the Earth, and he believed that we would eventually have this sort of conscious activation of the Earth's psychic field, and it would lead to this rainbows appearing everywhere. So it's I think sometimes it's these really like edge realm phenomena that people don't pay attention to, which is what psychedelics was 30 years ago when I started looking into it. A lot of the most interesting stuff happens in these little edge worlds, and then you begin to explore them, and they open up and open up.
Wonderful. Well, Daniel Pinchbeck, thank you for some deep thoughts today. Really appreciate
Thanks for having me. Good to chat.
And thank you everyone for listening.